In the year 1660, a civil war broke out in the Sultanate of Brunei that would change the map of Southeast Asia forever. This wasn't just a small disagreement, it was a long, bloody struggle for the throne between two powerful men, Sultan Abdul Hakkul Mubin and his nephew Sultan Muhyiddin. For years, the fighting dragged on until it reached its breaking point at a tiny fortified island called Pulau Chermin, located at the mouth of the Brunei River. The war had become a stalemate. Sultan Muhyiddin controlled the capital while his rival, Sultan Mubin, had retreated to the safety of his island fortress. Sultan Muhyiddin realized he could not end this war easily. He needed a secret weapon, so he looked across the sea to the Sultanate of Sulu. At this time, the Sulu world was known for its seafaring warriors, feared and respected across the Suluan Sea and the coasts of Borneo. Muhyiddin sent an urgent message to the Sultanate of Sulu with a huge offer. If Sulu helped him secure victory, Brunei would reward Sulu with territory in the northeastern part of Borneo, land that overlaps with what we now know as parts of Sabah. It was like offering someone a big chunk of your house just for helping you fix a broken door. The Sultan of Sulu agreed, and the fleet of Sulu warboats sailed toward Brunei. This is where the story becomes very messy, because from this point on, different peoples tell very different versions of what happened next. In Sulu traditions, their warriors were the heroes. They say their forces came to Brunei's aid, fought bravely, and were a crucial part of the effort that finally brought down Sultan Mubin's cause. From their point of view, without their support, Sultan Muhyiddin would never have secured the throne, and the promised land in northeastern Borneo was a debt fully earned. If you look at Brunei's side of the story and at a later historical summary based on Bruneian perspectives, the picture is very different. In that version, the decisive victory of Pulau Chermin is credited mainly to Brunei's own forces who used their resources and firepower to end the war and kill Sultan Mubin. In these accounts, Sulu's role is small, uncertain, or not clearly confirmed at all. Sulu may have been present, but they are not portrayed as the ones who stormed the fortress and turned the tide. It is like a group project where one person insists they did the hard work while another claims they were just watching from the side and arrived too late to matter. What most versions agree on is the ending. When the smoke cleared, Sultan Muhyiddin emerged as the undisputed ruler of Brunei. But almost immediately, a new conflict began, this time over the bill. The Sultan of Sulu believed the royal promise had been made and now came to collect his reward, control over the promised territory in northeastern Borneo. Sultan Muhyiddin, however, was in a very difficult position. His kingdom was exhausted. The civil war had drained Brunei's strength, its treasury was weakened, and its soldiers were worn out. On top of that, he was not eager to part with valuable territory, especially if he believed Sulu's help had not been decisive. Here is where politics and memory collide. In later legal and historical debates, there is no clear surviving signed document showing Brunei formally transferring all of Sabah to Sulu. Brunei would later point to this lack of a written deed as proof that no full, formal cession ever happened. From Sulu's point of view, however, a promise made by a sultan was a sacred contract, whether or not someone wrote it down on paper. So, instead of a neat handover, what emerged was a gap. Sulu insisted a grant of territory had been promised and morally earned. Brunei retained the position that nothing was ever formally signed away. This disagreement played out against a harsh reality. Brunei had become, in many ways, the sick man of the region. After years of civil war and other pressures, the state no longer had the same strength to project power over distant coasts. It claimed lands on maps and in royal memory, but it struggled to send enough ships, soldiers, or officials to actually control them. This is what people mean by a power vacuum, a situation where a government says it owns a place but cannot really enforce its authority there on the ground. Seeing that Brunei was weak and far away, the Sultan of Sulu acted according to what he believed was his rightful claim. Instead of launching one massive invasion, Sulu influence grew step by step along the coasts and rivers of northeastern Borneo. The Sultan of Sulu appointed datus, local leaders or lords, to settle along important river mouths and harbors. These datus set up trading posts, collected taxes from local communities, and controlled valuable coastal trade in products like birds' nests, pearls, and sea cucumbers, which were in high demand in regional and Chinese markets. In practice, the Sultan of Sulu became the landlord of much of northeastern Sabah coast, not because of a modern title deed, but because his officials, ships, and flags were physically there. For roughly the next century and more, an awkward and confusing situation took shape. If you were in the Brunei Palace and looked at their understanding of the world, you would hear that these lands were still part of Brunei's dominion because there was no formal deed transferring them away. But if you actually traveled to many parts of northeastern coast of Sabah during that time, you would see Sulu banners, Sulu datus collecting revenue, and Sulu-linked ships patrolling the waters. Brunei kept the title in its royal memory. Sulu held the keys along the shoreline. Brunei was unhappy about this, but its weakness left it trapped. It could not easily force Sulu out, and it could not simply ignore Sulu either. So the situation simmered in a kind of tense silence, overlapping claims, no clear written settlement between the two courts, and very different memories of what had been promised during the old civil war. This long, half-settled story is exactly why things became so complicated when European businessmen and imperial officials appeared in the late 1800s. British interests saw North Borneo as a place to build a chartered company, plantations, and trading ports. But when they looked at who claimed the land, they found a tangle. Brunei still asserted sovereignty over parts of North Borneo, especially on the west and interior. Sulu claimed rights over much of northeastern coast based on the old grant it believed it had received as a reward for helping in Brunei's civil war. There was no single universally accepted owner. To protect their investment, British concession hunters did something clever. They bought insurance from both sides. In 1877, representatives obtained grants from the Sultan of Brunei for territory in North Borneo, paying him a yearly compensation in exchange for these rights. Then, in 1878, they sailed to the Sultan of Sulu and signed another agreement for rights over North Borneo, again in exchange for an annual payment that would continue to be paid to Sulu's heirs long afterward. By securing overlapping grants, one from Brunei and one from Sulu, they tried to make sure that neither court would feel completely cut out and that neither side would have a clear excuse to attack the new British operation. This tangled history is the deep root of the modern Sabah claim that still appears in arguments between Malaysia and the Philippines today. The Philippine side bases its position on the historical rights of the Sulu Sultanate, which in turn rest on the idea of a grant from Brunei linked to help in the 17th century civil war and reinforced, in their view, by the 1878 agreement. The Malaysian side, inheriting the position of the British and Brunei, points to the lack of a clear Brunei to Sulu cession deed for all of Sabah, to later treaties that extinguish Sulu's external claims, and to the fact that Sabah's people joined Malaysia through modern political processes. At the heart of it all is that moment on a tiny island, Pulau Chermin, where two different memories were born. One tradition talks about the spirit of a royal promise and a reward that was morally earned. The other, tradition, clings to the letter of written law, insisting that what was never clearly surrendered on paper was never truly lost. Because the two sultans never left behind a clean, mutually signed contract that everyone could point to, the world inherited two different versions of the truth. And that is how a royal quarrel, later remembered as having started over something as small as a cockfighting insult, helped trigger a civil war in the 1600s and created a land dispute that lawyers, diplomats, and historians are still arguing about more than 350 years later.